our economy is just so fragile. It's so ripe for a recession in the first place. And so, this government shutdown definitely could put us into, I think, a recession.
SDBullion.com is a high-volume physical gold, silver, and precious metal dealer. Founded in March 2012 with the goal of providing the lowest cost bullion available, SD Bullion has become one of the largest US-based precious metal dealers and is regularly recognized by Inc. magazine as one of America's fastest growing companies. SD Bullion continues to gain industry market share by being one of the premier low-cost options for physical precious metal bullion buyers and sellers. At SDBullion.com, you can order your guaranteed physical precious metal bullion products online, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Discreet, low-cost delivery is both fast and always fully insured. We are committed to being your trusted source for low-cost, highest quality investment-grade bullion products. Visit SDBullion.com for more information.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with SilverDoctors.com, and with us today is Matt from the Silver Fortune YouTube channel. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey Elijah, it's great to speak with you again.
All right. Now, I was watching some of your recent videos on YouTube. I find them so informative. And one of the latest videos you made was about the government shutdown. And I think it's really important to talk about this because it is the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. And you were saying that this shutdown could actually push the U.S. into a recession. Why do you think that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, as of right now, the day we're recording this video, something like 800,000 government workers are set to miss their second paycheck in a row. First of all, I think that the big takeaway from this that I saw somebody bring up the other day was this really shows just how unprepared our economy is for something like a recession. That we're worried about a recession after something like 800,000 otherwise fairly well-paid government workers are out of work. But the reason that I was talking about this potentially sending us into recession is because basically the basic economics of it. You have people not getting paychecks, and therefore they are going to basically not be spending that money into the economy. I mean, something like 70% of our economy is based on consumption, and we have that large amount of people no longer spending their money on whatever it might be, basic goods, paying their mortgage payment, their car payment, et cetera. And yet, the argument that some have made, in fact, I saw one of the White House officials the other day making this argument that, quarter one GDP might be kind of low because of this shutdown, but quarter two is going to be great. I don't think that argument quite holds up either because, when consumers, miss these types of paychecks when they are really behind on all of this, behind in their finances, I don't think their first gut reaction when they ultimately get the back pay, when the government ultimately comes back online, I don't think their first reaction is going to be, let's go out and spend it all, right? They're going to pay off the bills that they need to pay off. But beyond that, I wouldn't be surprised if they are more careful going forward. Plus, there's going to be some that maybe were already late on some debt payments. There's going to be many that are going to have to pay things like late fees. And so I don't think that it's going to be all hunky-dory once quarter two comes around. But, I want to make one thing clear. I don't think that this government shutdown is a huge deal to the economy. I don't think it's going to be. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the economy is already ripe for a recession. The analogy I used in one of my recent videos or live streams was, it's as if you have a barrel of explosives that is not being stored correctly on a military base. Okay. And it's just open out in the air. It's not being stored correctly, and it's let's say it's some sort old style explosives that can be set off by friction, by a spark, whatever. And ultimately one day there's some people guarding it or whatever, and then somebody lights up a cigarette, and when they toss the butt away afterwards, it lands in the explosives, and and explodes. And at the end of the day, you got to ask, who's ultimately responsible? Is it the person that was, smoking that cigarette, or was it the fact that it wasn't being stored correctly, that it was a huge liability in the first place? And that's kind of how I view our economy, whether we're talking about this trade war and the detrimental effects of that, or this government shutdown, and both of which are somewhat manufactured crises. They're avoidable. It's not so much that they are major factors into the economy. It's just that our economy is just so fragile. It's so ripe for a recession in the first place. And so, this government shutdown definitely could put us into, I think, a recession here in quarter one, quarter two. The economy might go on a little bit longer after that. But the other thing to keep in mind is that, these types of manufactured, avoidable crises, they very well could be used by the government to look for a scapegoat, right? Let's not blame this recession on high amounts of debt, on irresponsible fiscal and monetary policy for years and years. No, let's blame it on something like a government shutdown or a trade war or China. That's an easy scapegoat without really having to face up to some of the deeper underlying problems in our economy and our society.
And can you get into, using that analogy of explosives, what are some of the explosives in this situation with the economy?
Yeah, I mean, the real basic ones would be things like debt, and every economy is going to carry debt at various levels of the economy. But as a whole, I would say debt as a result of, as I said, irresponsible monetary policy, where you keep interest rates at historical lows for thousands of years. I'm talking below 0% in terms of real rates when you compare it to inflation and whatnot. For, how long were they there? Like 6 years, 7 years before they slightly raised them. Even today, they're, by historical standards, very low. Things like quantitative easing, and that's just on the monetary side of it. And that's just the Fed, right, that I'm talking about here. We also have irresponsible policies from the ECB, from the Bank of Japan, from the People's Bank of China. Those really kind of set the stage for these individual, I guess, markets blowing up or crises that you'll see, I think, in the next downturn, whether it's things like high yield debt or corporations that are going under, not unlike back in 2008, with the auto sector and with the financial sector. It's not so much that those companies are just terrible companies. It's that they were unable to take on an unrealistic amount of debt. And it's not just at the corporate level; it's happened at the consumer level as well, and of course the sovereign level.
Now, with respect to national debt, you recently actually made a video on this, and it was really interesting because there's this new monetary theory essentially saying that the national debt is our surplus, so it doesn't really matter. And you were saying, some people just say that debt doesn't really matter around the world because we just owe it all to each other. So someone is on the other side of that. What do you say to those thoughts?
Yeah. And of course, you're referring to something called modern monetary theory, which I had not heard of until very recently. And I think it's something that's being pushed forward by that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that everybody is so worked up about, the newly elected congresswoman. But yeah, basically the idea behind it is that when you have debt at the sovereign level, when you have a country like the United States that can, issue our own currency, print our own money, that when they create debt, ultimately the economy benefits from it. It's not, that portion of it is not a new argument. I mean, that sounds very, Keynesian in theory or something like that, where when the government increases their spending, that's going to boost economic growth, et cetera. And there's some truth to that, at least on the surface. It looks like GDP is higher when the government spends money. But I guess their new twist on this is that, deficits don't really matter, period, as long as they are within reason. Basically, the only fear they have when a country can print their own money, the only worry that they have is inflation. Basically, at some point, when you keep monetizing debt, when you keep issuing more and more IOUs, eventually your currency, unsurprisingly, is going to lose value. So it's modern monetary theory. It's I think something that we're going to see embraced by the left, as well as some I wouldn't be surprised if some Republicans embrace this as well, especially with, how the finances have been over the last, 2 years. But yeah, I mean, basically the idea behind it is that we can spend as much money as we want at the sovereign level as long as we can print our own money. And the problem that they point out is, of course, inflation. I think it's a huge problem. I think inflation by nature is not something that can be easily controlled by just, reducing the deficit here or there, or raising interest rates here or there. The Fed would love to think that that's the case, that inflation, or the government as well, that inflation can always be easily controlled by cutting or increasing spending or cutting or raising interest rates. But the truth of the matter is that at some point, inflation is going to have to rise higher. At some point, the Fed is going to have to make a very difficult decision. Same thing goes for the federal government, of either having higher inflation or poor economic growth. I mean, this idea of modern monetary theory, if you have an economy that is reliant on the government spending more and more money each year, and that's how it's going to work out. I mean, if you look at a chart of the increases of debt in the U.S. economy at the consumer level, at the corporate level, at the sovereign level, it's, each year as a whole, not perfect rule, but each year as a whole, there's more debt than there was last year. And that's how our economy works, unfortunately. It's a debt-based economy. If you have an economy that is based on this idea that the government needs to spend more and more money, run larger and larger deficits each year, at some point that's going to get out of control. Of course, some people would argue it's already gotten out of control. And so then your two options are, well, we're going to keep going on this going on this current course because of political expediency or whatever. And the end result of that is going to be more and more inflation as more and more debt is monetized, more and more money is printed, et cetera. Or you can, use the A word that so many people in Europe are afraid of, and yet we almost never hear in the United States, and that's austerity, right? Use austerity, cut deficits or cap them at a certain level. But then when you have an economy that is, according to modern monetary theory, benefiting from all this extra deficit spending, well, the end result of that is going to be an economy that's really struggling. The other major takeaway from this, both from government spending, but also this government shutdown and these 800,000 workers that are out of work. What I like to think about is how could that have been spent better? Whether we're talking about these massive deficits or these workers out of work, they're paid for by taxes. And of course, treasury bonds, whatever, Federal Reserve and their debt monetization, sure. But how could those resources, how could that money have been utilized better? And it's really, I think this government shutdown makes a good case for reducing the size of government. Had these workers never been hired in the first place, those taxes would have never had to been collected. And think of how much better those resources could have been utilized by the free market. Think of how much better the debt that the country is currently in. Think of how much better that money could have been utilized by a more free market system. Because as a general rule of thumb, government, even if government spending in theory, increases economic activity, the free market usually is much better at utilizing and distributing that money to where it needs to go. But I guess that's kind of another takeaway from both of those issues.
Regarding the inflation problem because of rising debts and deficits, what is your perspective? I mean, that does beg the question is why is inflation bad? I mean, I see how hyperinflation is definitely, it's hard for people to, keep up with that. But when it comes to somewhat slow inflation, I mean, it's bad for people who are saving money, but it's good for debtors. What is your perspective? Why is inflation a bad thing?
Well, I mean, besides, of course, the real threat of much higher inflation, which leads to much less stable prices and seriously can hurt the economy. I mean, I think you kind of hit on the head that savers are discouraged from saving, but also you overall just how how capital is allocated. I think shifts as a result of inflation. It discourages saving, it encourages spending. The whole idea of stability of prices kind of goes out the window. And ultimately, as you said, it's those that are in large amounts of debt that benefit from it. And so it encourages, being in debt, right? So, it's a very good question of why inflation, and ultimately I'd say destruction of currency is not a good thing over the long term. You look at something like the U.S. dollar has lost something like 97% of its value in the last 100 plus years, since the Federal Reserve was created. That's over the long term not extremely noticeable for people, and even inflation today, people realize that it exists, but they don't see it as a major factor in their own life. And yet, what if inflation 5 years from now were to look more like it did back in the 1970s, where we're talking 10+% inflation? That can seriously disrupt markets. But even in the meantime, this 2%, 3% stuff, but going by these official numbers, it's theft by inflation. You look at things like, a great example would be tax cuts. I'm not getting political here, but the recent tax cuts that went into effect at the beginning of 2018, people are talking about how that's great. They're going to be able to keep more of their paycheck, and I tend to agree. As I was saying earlier, I'm not a huge fan of taxes, and so tax cuts are great. But the problem with that, when it comes to deficits and tax cuts that occur without spending cuts, is that ultimately that's going to make its way back into the economy in the form of inflation. So yes, you might have a tax cut, but you're also going to have a tax hike in the form of inflation, a hidden tax, if you will. And so we have a situation today where you have things like wages, which have increased at a fairly low rate since, going back to like the 1980s, 1970s. And then you have, expenses, consumer goods, et cetera, things like housing, healthcare, college, food, gasoline, et cetera, that has inflated at a much faster rate than wages have. I mean, that again, I think that's another example of why inflation can be so damaging to an economy and why it can really lower the standard of living. As I said, it's a tax. It's an invisible tax, but it's a tax on those that choose to save. And I guess it's a windfall for those that choose to carry a high amount of debt.
And is there a reason you were saying that, it does get worse if inflation does increase, if down the road we see 10% inflation or something like that? Is there a reason, in your opinion, to think inflation will increase that much?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the end game, when we're talking about things like ever rising amounts of debt in the U.S. economy, irresponsible monetary policy, QE, 0% interest rates, all of that, the end game in my mind has always been higher and higher inflation. I mean, that's the two options that they have, is higher inflation or, some sort of deflationary spiral, where the Fed decides to not lower rates as much as they should, or raise rates higher than the markets and the economy will tolerate, where the U.S. government decides to institute austerity rather than ever increasing spending and ever increasing deficits. But I don't see any evidence of the latter, of deflation, or a situation where the Fed and the government actually act somewhat responsibly for once, because it's just not politically expedient. Now, if there's some, people always talk about, the Fed raising rates because they want to crash the economy on Trump's watch, or, if there's some other reason that the Fed and the government wanted to crash the economy, sure, there's a case for it there. But otherwise, I just don't see any evidence of Congress, of the White House, any White House, or the Federal Reserve ever acting in a responsible way over the long term, looking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years out, or how is this debt, how is this situation going to pan out for the next generation? No, they're thinking about the next election. They're thinking about the next 6 months, 2 years, et cetera. And so ultimately where this ends, I think, is hyperinflation, right? I think every fiat currency eventually, dies that death. And I think the US dollar will be no exception. Now, in real terms, in the future, what is that going to look like? We very well might be heading for a situation over the next year or two where the big talk in the media is going to be, deflation as we kind of come up into this next recessionary cycle. But I think it's going to be how governments and how the Federal Reserve respond to the next recession that will lead to much higher inflation rates, whether that's QE, whether that's helicopter money, which I think will be much more effective increasing inflation than QE would be, 0% or negative interest rates, and of course, lots and lots of government spending. All of those factors I see as being a big part of inflation increasing in the future. And the other piece of it is that there are a lot of U.S. dollars abroad. This is something people have been talking about for years, and I think we'll see it play out in the future. But there's a lot of U.S. dollars abroad because there's a huge demand for the U.S. dollar around the world, whether it be for reserves or for trade. Of course, it's kind of the de facto world reserve currency. Of course, there's a petrodollar system, and so there's all this trade that occurs in U.S. dollars, and there's all these countries that their central banks choose to use dollars as a reserve, in their currency reserves to defend their currency, etc. At some point in the future, when you have high amounts of inflation and when you have an empire, a country that is on the decline, I think you're going to see the U.S. dollar, lose that status, and you're going to see the U.S. dollar being utilized at a much lower rate for things like trade or for currency reserves. And you're going to see those dollars, ultimately come back. They're not going to stay overseas. They're going to come back to the United States. And so that's going to be another contributor to this inflation in the future. So that's another thing that's, a couple of years out, 5 years out. It really depends on how quickly this plays out in terms of recession and how the powers that be respond to that recession.
Speaking of countries not using the dollar anymore, what sort of benefit would that be for them to trade in other currencies other than the U.S. dollar?
Yeah, well, you take an example like Iran. Of course, Iran is subject to sanctions from the United States right now, and we've kind of made the attempt over the last couple of years to rope in a lot of other countries to help us to sanction Iran to kind of achieve our goals. Makes sense. If you're going to sanction a country, you might as well have some other major economies sanction them as well and not do trade, et cetera, because it's going to hurt them even more. And yet, what you've seen is country after country decide, we're still going to buy oil from Iran, whether it's India or China. You see countries still decide to trade with them. And I think that's going to be kind of the case going forward, that the U.S. is going to continue to try and throw around our weight when it comes to trade and sanctions and use our dollar as a weapon, right? If you you take a country take a look at a country like Cuba or Venezuela or Iran or in the past countries like Libya, if you cut them off from the U.S. dollar system, we've used it as a weapon to try and achieve our goals. Well, in the future, I think more and more it's going to be the case that fewer and fewer countries actually follow along with that. So I think there is some huge benefit to using some other currency, a native currency. If it's Russia and China doing trade with each other in yuan and rubles, or China and India in yuan and rupees, whatever the case might be. I think there's a huge benefit over the long term for those countries to get out of the U.S. dollar system, not only because it's not a stable system, but also because the U.S. dollar has given the U.S. an incredible amount of power over the years, both economic and political power over the last in the post World War II period. And I think there's a lot of countries that are kind of sick of that. And I'm not even just thinking of China and Russia, but even I think the Euro system and India and many other countries are kind of sick of this dollar system. And more, I think you're going to see them ultimately leave the dollar system and start doing trade in more local currencies. It's going to be a slow process. It has been a slow process, but where we're at today in terms of de-dollarization by the ruble or the yuan or the rupee, it's at a very different place than it was, even just a couple of years ago. And so death by 1,000 cuts for the U.S. dollar. But I think that there is a huge motivation for countries to de-dollarize. They no longer have to be bullied around by the U.S. Government and our kind of arbitrary trade policy. They also don't have to worry about any instability of the dollar going forward.
Now, before we let you go, Matt, if you could just give a quick update on precious metals. We've seen them rise, since late December. What is your perspective on the rise we've seen, and what is your outlook for the price and the demand in this year?
Yeah, great question. So we have seen them rise off of their lows that we saw for a good portion of the second half of 2018, and yet it has stalled out somewhat. With silver not being able to punch to that $16 level currently, $15.40 level, somewhere around there. Gold, similar story, unable to punch through 1,300. It's around $1,280 right now. Historically, this has been a good season for metals to move up. And so, that tends to be my default position that I think we're going to still see silver and gold move up somewhat to the future. I don't see a huge breakout in 2019 to 1,600 for gold or 25 for silver or anything like that. But I do think that the low was back in second half of 2018, whenever that was, September, October, or August, and that in 2019, I think the story is going to be them moving up in terms of demand. It's hard to say. Thus far, we have very little information on where demand's at in 2019. The U.S. Mint has some kind of preliminary numbers on Silver Eagle demand in January of this year, which was so far it's been stronger than last year, but that's very preliminary. You can't make a ton of assumptions based on that data. And so, going forward in 2019, I think I've said this for a while, but the next big catalyst for precious metals, especially here in the United States, is going to be the Federal Reserve and how they respond to this next recession. I would look for the Fed to ultimately stop their interest rate hike policy, as well as halt their quantitative tightening program. Those are the two big moves that I'm looking for from the Fed. Of course, eventually we're going to see the opposite of QT. You're going to see QE again. You're going to see whatever other policies they cook up, 0% interest rates, et cetera. But once you see a concrete pivot from the Fed where they say we're going to slow down or halt our QT program altogether, and we're definitely probably not going to raise rates anytime soon, that's going to be a big catalyst for precious metals, because I think it's going to send the dollar down quite a bit, unsurprisingly. And so, I think that's going to be a big catalyst for the price, but it's also going to be a big catalyst for demand as you see that panic at the central banking level again. Not unlike, back in 2008 and the massive amounts of demand that we've seen since then. People are going to be fearful for the future of their job, of the economy, of the U.S. dollar. And I think many of them are going to choose to hedge in something fiscal, something that does not carry counterparty risk, something that is, in my opinion, very undervalued right now, and something that is going to act as a hedge for the, I think, rough seas ahead.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time today. Before I let you go, did you want to share with the viewers where they can find you online, and any last thoughts you had?
Yeah, you can find me over on YouTube, of course, Silver Fortune YouTube, and then I'm also on most major podcast platforms, iTunes, Android, Google, Pocket Cast, Spotify, etc. So you can find me over there as well. Some people prefer to listen because most of my work is audio. It's mostly just in a podcast format anyways. So podcasts work well for that as well. But that's where they can find me.
All right, great. Once again, thank you so much for your time, Matt.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Elijah.